Maybe you felt it too, that quiet pull, a sense that this plant, so tangled in controversy and cliché, might hold something more than we were told. Not a way to check out, but a way to tune in, before the laws, before the labels. Cannabis was sacred. It sat beside sages and seekers, used in temples, ceremonies, moments of silence. It wasn't about getting high. It was about getting home. But somehow, over time, we forgot. We were told it made us lazy, addicted, lost, that it was a drug to fear or at best a habit to hide. And so, little by little, a tool for awakening was turned into a symbol of escape. But what if that story isn't the whole truth? What if cannabis was never the problem, only our forgetting of how to use it with care? This isn't about promoting a plant. It's about remembering a practice, a way of relating, a way of being. So if something inside you has wondered, why does this call to me? Why now? Maybe you're not just curious, maybe you're ready to see it not as a crutch but as a companion, not as a vice but as a vessel, to let go of what you've been told and feel into what you've always known. This isn't a video about getting high, it's about coming home. Long before weed became a political battleground, a cultural punchline, or something you casually pick up at the corner dispensary, there was reverence. Not the kind shouted from pulpits, but the quiet kind. The kind whispered during ceremony. The kind passed down in the stillness between breath and flame. In the ancient Vedic tradition, cannabis wasn't called a drug. It was called one of the 5 sacred plants. They believed it was gifted by the gods, not to numb life but to unlock it. In those early rituals, they would grind it into a sacred drink known as bang, a potion used not to escape the body, but to journey deeper into it. It was taken during festivals honoring Shiva, the god of transformation. Not for the party, for the transcendence. Halfway across the world, in the mountains of ancient China, archaeologists unearthed the remains of shamans buried with bundles of cannabis. Not by accident, not by habit, but as a portal, an intentional tool to connect with the spirit world. In those silent tombs, needled with smoke-stained bones and faded fabrics, you can almost feel it. This wasn't about getting high. This was about getting home. In Rastafari culture, the tradition is still alive. They gather in small circles, not to pass time, but to enter what they call a reasoning session, a sacred dialogue with each other, with their ancestors, with Jah. The smoke rising in spirals isn't decoration. It's intention, it's prayer. For them, cannabis is not an escape route. It's a vehicle for cosmic consciousness. And when the moment lands, they don't drift off. They drop in. Over and over again, across civilizations and continents, cannabis appears not as a way out, but as a way in to presence, into clarity, into what some might call soul and others simply call self. So how did something once called holy become something dismissed, demonized, even feared? That's a story we'll get to. But before we unpack the fall, we have to understand the beginning. Because if we skip over the reverence, if we erase the sacred, we risk missing the entire point. Weed, when seen clearly, isn't a joke. It isn't even medicine. It's memory. A memory that maybe, just maybe, you've been carrying in your breath, your bones, your body, this whole time. And now it's time to remember. It wasn't about getting stoned. That was never the point. In ancient rituals, cannabis was part of a spiritual toolkit, used with the same care you might offer to fire or breath or silence. In India, bhang wasn't sipped on a whim. It was prepared in quiet reverence, brewed during holy festivals where people didn't drink to forget, but to remember. The drink, often taken before meditation or chanting, wasn't meant to dull the senses. It was meant to soften the noise between you and the divine, just enough to let something deeper in. In Central Asia, tribes gathered around fire. They didn't smoke cannabis for fun. They burned it in stone pits during rituals, letting the smoke rise through the air like a bridge between this world and another. The air thickened, not with confusion, but with clarity. They weren't escaping, they were arriving. And in Rastafari culture, cannabis is never used carelessly. It's a sacrament, often paired with chanting, drumming, and deep conversation. They do get high, they reason. They share space with the divine, the community, the ancestors. The smoke is a presence, not a prop. A way to see clearer, not to blur the view. Across these traditions, cannabis wasn't a standalone experience. It was always part of something larger, a ceremony, a moment, a breath. It was accompanied by prayer, intention, stillness. The leaf wasn't the lesson, it was the guide, a doorway, a teacher. Imagine using it like that, not to override your mind, but to tune it. To amplify what's already whispering beneath the surface. To invite silence, not fill it. To drop in, not drift away. This is the part we've lost. The rituals, the rhythm, the respect. Modern culture has turned cannabis into a product, a label, a trend. But in its original form, it was never a brand. It was a bridge. And like any true tool of transformation, its power didn't come from the plant alone. It came from how we approached it. Cannabis doesn't offer revelation on demand. It responds to presence. It reveals in proportion to how deeply you're willing to listen. In the old world, they knew this, and maybe part of us still does. So before we move forward, maybe we have to look back, not to copy, but to remember what sacred once meant, and to wonder, what if it still does? It didn't fall on its own. Cannabis didn't just fade from temples and sacred spaces, it was pushed. And the hands that pushed it were deliberate, strategic, and loud. In the early 20th century, a wave of fear began to rise in the Western world. Newspapers ran headlines claiming marijuana turned people into violent criminals, unhinged lunatics, moral threats. None of it was true. But truth was never the goal. Control was. The infamous Reefer Madness campaign was less a public health warning, more a psychological operation. A carefully crafted narrative meant to disconnect the plant from its sacred roots and rebrand it as a threat to order. And behind the fear, money, politics, power. You see, cannabis didn't just threaten legal codes, it threatened cultural control. Because when people connect deeply with themselves, when they wake up to presence, to inner clarity, to the possibility of something beyond the material, it becomes harder to sell them fear, harder to make them obey. So instead of facing that awakening, systems chose to suppress it. And what better way than to turn a sacred plant into a symbol of shame? By the mid-20th century, cannabis was not only criminalized, it was villainized. But this wasn't a spiritual judgment. It was a political move, a racialized one too. Policies were passed not to protect the public but to target specific communities, often black, brown, immigrant, and to justify a wider web of surveillance and punishment. At the same time, the original context of the plant was stripped away. No more ritual, no more reverence, just stigma, and eventually silence. Decades passed and something strange happened. The world began to forget. People forgot that cannabis was once used in temples, that it was paired with prayer, that it helped seekers soften the walls of ego and hear something deeper. It became a commodity, branded, packaged, monetized. A product to consume, not a portal to approach. And yet, even buried under all the fear and falsehood, something never quite died. The plant remained, waiting, not to be worshipped, but to be remembered. And maybe that's why it's still here, still calling, still whispering in smoke and leaf and breath. I'm not what they told you I am. I never was. So if you've ever felt there was more to this story, there is. And you're not wrong for wanting to hear it. It doesn't always start with light. Sometimes it starts with a shattering. There's a moment, quiet but undeniable, when you take that breath in, hold it, and something shifts. You think you're just relaxing. You think the noise will fade and the tension will melt. And it does at first. But then, something else begins to stir. You stop thinking in straight lines. The stories you tell yourself start to feel a little looser. Your name, your job, your roles, all the masks begin to slip. Not violently, not dramatically, but like fog in the morning sun, dissolving, evaporating, revealing something behind it. This isn't the kind of high that sends you laughing uncontrollably or stuck on the couch with cravings. This is different. This is the kind of high that drops you into a stillness, so deep it feels like someone pressed mute on your entire personality. And suddenly, you're face to face with the part of you that exists before the performance. The part that watches, the part that knows. In spiritual circles, they call it ego death. But that phrase can sound intimidating, even dramatic. What it really means is this: the stories that used to define you stop holding you so tightly. You realize you're not just the thoughts in your head or the reactions in your body. You're something else, something older, something quieter. And cannabis, when used with reverence, doesn't cause this. It reveals it. It's not breaking you down for the sake of chaos. It's inviting you to let go of the walls you've built out of fear, expectation, habit. It says, what happens if you stop trying to be someone and just be here? That moment can be uncomfortable. It can feel like falling. But sometimes falling is how we find the ground. That's the difference between getting high and waking up. Getting high is about escape. Waking up is about return. Not everyone is ready for that kind of truth, and that's okay. Cannabis doesn't force, it reflects. And when approached with care, with clear intention, it doesn't distort your reality. It strips it of illusion. If you've ever used cannabis and felt like everything was falling apart inside you, maybe you weren't breaking down. Maybe you were breaking open. And maybe that opening, scary as it felt, was actually the first honest glimpse of yourself you've had in a long time. You're not alone in that experience. It happens to more of us than you think. Not because we're weak or lost, but because something inside us knows there's more. And sometimes the breakdown is the beginning, You don't need more. You need meaning. That's the shift from habit to ritual, from lighting up out of routine to entering a moment with reverence. Because when you treat cannabis like a tool, it can open something inside you that no checklist ever could. But how do you begin? It starts before the inhale. Clear the space. Not just physically, though tidying the room, dimming the lights, maybe lighting Palo Santo or incense helps, but emotionally too. Let the noise of the day soften. Turn off your phone. Let stillness settle like dust in a forgotten room. Then set your intention. This isn't about control, it's about clarity. Why are you entering this space? To listen, to heal, to remember. Whisper it, write it, hold it in your palm. Let the plant know what you're seeking, not as a command, but as an invitation. Now breathe slowly, gently. Bring awareness into your body. Roll your shoulders, soften your jaw. As you light up, don't rush. Let it be slow, sacred. Feel the smoke move through you like a river returning to its source. Then sit, or lie down, or move if your body calls for it. But don't force the experience. Don't try to reach for something extraordinary. Let it come to you. And if nothing comes, that's sacred too. Because spiritual cannabis isn't about chasing visions or floating off into space. It's about deepening your presence in the now. About letting go of the need to feel a certain way and allowing what is to surface. Sometimes that looks like insight. Sometimes it's grief. Sometimes it's just quiet. All of it belongs. And when it feels complete, whenever that may be, come back gently. Drink water, stretch, reflect. Maybe journal a few words, not to analyze, but to anchor. What did you notice? What shifted even subtly? That final step is what separates ritual from routine. Integration. Carrying what you received back into your everyday life. Not as a high, but as a reminder. This isn't about becoming someone new. It's about returning to someone ancient. Someone who's been waiting in your breath, your bones, your silence. You don't need to be a monk. You don't need a perfect setup. All you need is attention, intention, and the willingness to meet yourself fully, gently, truthfully. In the end, it's not about the plant. It's about the path. And cannabis, when honored, simply walks with you. It's not what you think. Or rather, it's not only what you think. Because when used with intention, cannabis doesn't lift you out of your body. It drops you deeper into it. It doesn't push you beyond the moment. It presses you into it, like warm palms guiding you to sit still right here. You begin to notice the quiet things, the texture of the air, the weight of your own breathing, the way your thoughts move, not in straight lines, but like clouds across a slow blue sky. It doesn't feel like losing control. It feels like letting go. The world around you doesn't disappear, it sharpens. Colors bloom at the edges. Sounds stretch out. Even silence has texture. And suddenly, you're not ahead of yourself anymore, chasing to-do lists or rehearsing regrets. You're just here, fully. It's not always dramatic. It's not meant to be. Sometimes presence is subtle, like the hum beneath a song. But it's the kind of subtle that fills you with awe, the kind that reminds you, this moment, this breath, it's enough. We spend most of our lives elsewhere, rushing forward, looping backward, numb to the now. But presence is what our nervous systems crave. It's the exhale we've been holding for too long. And cannabis, when approached like a ritual, not a reflex, can guide us back to that exhale. It's not an escape. It's a return. And for those of us who have been anxious, lost in thought, cut off from our own bodies, it can feel like coming home to a part of ourselves we forgot existed. This isn't about being high. It's about being here. The taste of your coffee, the sound of your footsteps, the feeling of your heart beating not as background noise but as proof you're alive right now. You don't need fireworks to find meaning. You just need to arrive. And cannabis, when respected, doesn't lead you away from life. It helps you feel it more fully. So no, you don't get high. You get present. And in a world constantly pulling your attention away, maybe presence is the real miracle. There's no shame in not knowing. We've all been handed mixed messages. Smoke to escape. Don't smoke at all. Use it for fun. Fear it. Legal, illegal, sacred, sinful. Somewhere between all those voices, the deeper question got lost. What are you using it for? Because cannabis isn't good or bad. It's a mirror. And how you use it, that's what reveals everything. So maybe now's a good time to pause and ask a few quiet questions. Not to judge yourself, but to check in. Because the truth is, even sacred tools can become distractions if we forget why we picked them up in the first place. Ask yourself this. When I reach for cannabis, am I trying to feel more or feel less? Do I use it to connect or to numb? Do I have a ritual or is it just a reflex? Does it help me return to myself or avoid myself? And perhaps the most honest one, when was the last time I used it with intention? These questions aren't meant to criticize. They're invitations, gentle lights on the path, asking you to step back into your own awareness. Because here's the secret. The shift doesn't come from stopping. It comes from remembering, from pausing before you light up, not to follow rules, but to tune in. What's moving in you? What needs to be seen, felt, softened? When cannabis is used with clarity, even a single breath can feel like a prayer, a moment of reconnection, a return to presence. But when it becomes automatic, something we grab for without thinking, it loses its magic. Not because it changed, but because we stopped listening. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to quit. You just need to ask, often, honestly, and let the answers guide you home. Because the point isn't to use it right like passing a test. The point is to meet yourself again and again in a way that's real. Sacred doesn't mean rare or dramatic. It just means intentional, deliberate, alive. And sometimes the most sacred act is simply slowing down enough to ask why. So if you've been wondering whether you're using cannabis as a bridge or a blindfold, maybe you already know. And maybe now you're ready to choose the bridge. It's a question more people are starting to ask, not just should I use cannabis, but how often and why. Because once you step onto the path of using it spiritually, not recreationally, the rhythm matters. The frequency isn't just about dosage, it's about depth. In ancient traditions, cannabis wasn't used every day. In the Vedic texts, it was considered sacred, used in ceremonies, not as routine. In Rastafari reasoning sessions, the plant was part of a circle, a communion. In early Taoist practices, it was paired with meditation, reverence, and silence, not distraction. These weren't accidental patterns. They knew something we've forgotten, that too much, even of a good thing, can dull the magic. In modern mindfulness, the same principle applies. You don't meditate all day, every day. You set aside sacred time. You give it space to breathe. Cannabis as a consciousness tool thrives in that space. So how much is enough? There's no perfect formula, but here's a gentle framework. Once a week, one intentional session. A space you hold like a ceremony, clear, quiet, deliberate. You set your intention, you breathe, you listen, and then you step away. Not out of punishment or fear, but to allow the experience to ripple through your life. Because here's the paradox: the less you use, the deeper it can go. When cannabis isn't a background habit, it becomes a foreground teacher. Your body responds differently. Your spirit tunes in more sharply. The subtle becomes sacred again. It's not about willpower. It's about remembering that this plant isn't here to replace your awareness. It's here to expand it. And that expansion needs rest, like sleep between dreams, like silence between notes. Of course, some seasons call for more support, and that's okay. But if you find yourself using daily without thought, ask gently, what am I reaching for? Is it peace, clarity, escape, presence? Knowing your need is the first step to meeting it with care. You don't need to measure your worth by your restraint, but you might find that spacing out your sessions brings more depth than piling them on. Sometimes less really is more, because what you seek isn't more intensity, but more meaning. And meaning takes space, stillness, intention. So the next time you wonder if you're using cannabis enough, try asking instead, am I using it well? And if the answer feels uncertain, trust that you can begin again. Always one breath, one ritual, one return to what matters. It's strange, isn't it? How something once buried, outlawed, mocked finds its way back, quietly, persistently, as if it never left, only waited. You've probably noticed it too. In recent years, the plant that was dismissed as a drug is now whispered about in temples, healing circles, retreats. Not as a tool for escape, but a doorway back to presence. This isn't a new discovery, it's a remembering. Long before laws and labels, cannabis was a sacred ally. Cultures knew this. Vedic seers, Taoist monks, Rastafari mystics, they didn't use it to forget. They used it to feel, to listen, to connect with the earth, with the self, with something larger. And maybe that's why it still calls to us today, not with shouts, but with a gentle pull. Not like a trend, but like a memory waking up inside the body. A sense that this plant once knew your breath, your stillness, your questions. This isn't nostalgia, it's realignment. Because in a world that's louder, faster, more fractured than ever, something in us craves the sacred again. We crave depth. We crave truth. And sometimes the path back to that truth comes through something as simple and ancient as a leaf. It's not about glamorizing the plant. It's not about pretending it's perfect. But it is about listening to what's resurfacing. Why now? Why here? Maybe because we're finally ready to use it differently. Not for distraction, but for devotion. And if you've ever felt that quiet calling, when you see the leaf, smell the smoke, or hear someone speak about its power, and something in your chest stirs like a bell in fog, and maybe that's not coincidence. Maybe that's your soul remembering. Because the return of cannabis to the spiritual space isn't just about legalization. It's about liberation of the heart, of the inner knowing, of all the ancient ways we've been told to forget. And now, after years of distortion, misuse, misunderstanding, we get to choose again. Not just if we use it, but how. Not just for the high, but for the homecoming. So if this plant still calls to you, it's not asking you to worship it. It's inviting you to wake up, to meet yourself again, to return. Maybe this is the part where we stop trying to explain it and just feel it. Cannabis has worn many names over the years: medicine, menace, crutch, cure. It's been praised, punished, praised again. But beneath all the noise, there's something quieter, older, something true. It was never about escaping the world. Not really. It was about remembering how to be in it with presence, with clarity, with reverence. It was about remembering yourself. When used with intention, cannabis doesn't carry you away, it brings you home. To the breath you forgot to notice. To the body you forgot to trust. To the questions you were too busy to ask. It holds up a mirror, and if you're willing to look, it shows you what's underneath the noise. Not to shame you, not to fix you, just to show you what's already there. This plant was never the destination. It was the lantern you held along the way. And maybe that's why so many are finding their way back to it now, not because it's trendy, but because something sacred in us is stirring. We're tired of numbing. We're tired of pretending. We want to feel real again, not high, not hidden, present. And in that space of presence, we remember the sacred was never out there. It was here all along, under the noise, beneath the habits, waiting patiently beneath our skin. You don't need to believe anything. You don't need to be anyone else. You just need to ask yourself honestly, gently, what you're really looking for. And if you feel the answer rise from somewhere deep and still, that's not just you thinking, that's remembering. Because cannabis, when approached with care, isn't just a plant, it's a portal, a breath, a return. And if today is the day you feel ready, ready to slow down, ready to listen, ready to meet yourself again, know this: the door was never closed. You just had to stop running long enough to find it again.